Welcome to the Smart Talk series, a Henry George School of Social Science podcast. The Smart Talk series is a weekly podcast with an array of discussions held with academics, policymakers, practitioners, and other professionals to explore new ideas and theories within the economics field. Our discussion today was recorded in June of 2023. Our talk is hosted by myself, Nathan Greene, a researcher here at the Henry George School, and our guest, Dr. Josh Cohen. Dr. Cohen received his master's and Ph.D. from the University of Amsterdam, both in economics. Before his academic career, Dr. Cohen worked in management consulting at Accenture. He has spent over 24 years studying and understanding the healthcare and pharmaceutical industry. Josh's expertise ranges from regulatory practices to drug discovery and has over 100 publications in numerous journals. In addition to his publications, Josh has written for numerous periodicals and is currently a contributor for Forbes. Together, we discuss the changes within the pharmaceutical industry caused by the Inflation Reduction Act, how drug prices are formulated from manufacturer to consumer, and why the Inflation Reduction Act is more of a reform than it is large-scale change. Before we get started with today's program, we also wanted to mention our upcoming annual conference. Why is housing so unaffordable? Causes and solutions. If you're curious as to why housing has been so expensive lately, this is the conference for you. Our panelists will discuss the causes of excessive housing prices and what policy responses should be. Our conference will be held on July 24th from 10 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. We'll leave a link to the event in the description, and we're looking forward to seeing you all there. We hope you enjoy this talk, and please make sure to check back on our page every week for a brand new episode. Josh Cohen, thank you for joining us on Smart Talk today.
Sure.
So
Thank you.
I'd like to start off the conversation by just kind of giving our listeners a brief overview of the pharmaceutical industry. If you could you just give us an overview of how drugs are produced, marketed, and then sold to consumers?
Sure. So my expertise is mostly on the post-approval end. So once a drug gets approved by the FDA and gets launched and marketed and all that. But your question is broader than that. So I can briefly go over what happens in pre-approval, very important. So drugs get developed over time. We call them clinical phases. There's even a preclinical phase and animal models, things like that. And it can take many, many years. Sometimes you see a new drug that's out there that gets launched and you might watch an ad on TV and you think, oh, that was just, developed. Well, it probably took 10, 15 years to get to that point. So they go through these clinical phases of development. And then at a certain point, hopefully, and of course, there are many failures along the road, but hopefully they get approved by the Food and Drug Administration. And the FDA's mandate is to look at safety, obviously, right? You don't want something that's toxic.
Right.
But also efficacy, which is defined as at least, better than placebo, right? That's the easiest test. And in some cases, comparing it to other drugs that are out there. And then from there, they look at things like quality of manufacturing practices, which can be relevant when you're looking at biologics because it's a live organism, it's a live drug in some ways, meaning it can act in certain ways if it's not manufactured properly, and that can lead to toxicity and adverse events. So FDA does a lot of work in that space. Then marketing. Obviously, once you have marketing, you still need to have, a captive audience, if you will. Some of that you can generate through advertising. Some of it's detailing physicians. That's the word they use. So you go around, and when I say you in this case, it's the drug maker. So say you have, I don't know, a new drug for asthma. And so you want to then go to respiratory specialists and maybe some primary care physicians and say, hey, we've got this new drug. Just look out for it. They might even be provided with samples, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But you also nowadays, because of the cost, and I do a lot of work on cost, nowadays you basically have to get buy-in from payers, from insurance companies,
Mm-hmm.
right? So That's part of the detailing process. They don't call it detailing necessarily. They don't do the same thing as they would with physicians. They don't give them samples, for example, but they do provide them with incentives, financial incentives, what are called rebates. They provide them with incentives to move market share. That's the word that's used or the phrase. So basically, you say, okay, we've got this new drug. We want it to be on formulary, the list of reimbursable products. And let's say they're talking to Aetna. You may have heard of Aetna, and they're a large company. Say, Aetna, if you could put that on formulary and please put it on a preferred position, meaning not too high a cost share for patients and
Mhm.
not too many hurdles, we'll get you a rebate. We'll provide you with a rebate at the end of, say, 6 months when you've proven to us that you've moved the product towards, sorry, you've moved the market share, right, towards this new product. And that's quite controversial. Some people call that a kickback because in some ways you can sort of sense it's almost like a bribe. I'm not
Right.
saying it is a bribe, but you kind of sense that, right? You figure, oh, you're paying us to move this market or move the market share towards the product. Does it really depend on how good the product is?
Mhm.
Not necessarily, right? It could simply be a financial power play at that stage. But it is very important for drug companies to get their products on formulary and to somehow gain market share. So that's a very rudimentary outline, a contour of what's going on. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the details on pricing and why that's an issue, not just for patients, but also payers and employers and others, and why the government has stepped in with the Inflation Reduction Act,
Right.
among other things, by the way. We've had other legislation over the years, going back to the Obama administration, but also the Bush administration and the early 2000s. There have been multiple attempts at trying to address the pricing issue, right? Pricing meaning, so you have the price of a drug, out of pocket costs can be very high, sometimes as high as the price of a drug if you're in the deductible phase. And, that's an issue, especially for older folks and people without means. But even people, like myself or you or others, let's say we have coverage and we're earning decent money, but it's still a lot. It's a big
Right.
burden on patients. But I'll let you fire away with more questions. I don't want this to be a monologue.
Well, so exploring a little bit about the industry as a whole, can you talk a little bit more about these rebates and kind of how those come into play? Do we know what determines the rebate or what relationship that has to the list price of a drug?
Excellent question, Nathan. It's just it's something I've been exploring for many years, and unfortunately, and I don't like to opine on things too much. I don't like to make this into a normative debate, if you will, what should happen. I'd
Hmm.
like to be objective. However, I will say this: rebates are often not connected, not tethered, if you will, to the clinical effectiveness of a product. So let's get
Hmm.
back to that asthma product. I'm not saying that asthma product was bad. It certainly passed muster. But oftentimes you have newly approved drugs, which, they're okay. They're a little bit better than the standard of care, or maybe not. And they get into this rebate game, right? In which, and really, there are many parties guilty. It's not just the drug maker, it's also the PBM, the pharmacy benefit manager or payer, who's in this rebate game where to them, a high list price can actually be beneficial, right? Because you can extract, this higher or greater rebate for
Right.
higher listed drugs. And that's been a problem with insulin. That's been a problem with asthma products, which I mentioned, in cardiovascular space, autoimmune. I mean, you name a therapeutic class, we've had these issues. My colleague Adam Fine, he calls it the gross to net bubble. It's a great term. It's not my term, it's Adam's. But it describes what's been going on. And one can say, yes, PBMs are doing a good job in lowering the net price, okay, or at least keeping the net price growth minimal.
Hmm.
But they're extracting this big rebate. And guess what they're also doing? the patient, let's say it's me, let's say I have asthma and I need that new medication. I'd like to have it. It just got approved, but it's got a very high list price. Guess what? My co-insurance, the percentage is based on the list, not the net price.
Mm.
So as that list price, and you'll see that in any graph, you look up a graph, and Kaiser Family Foundation does this a lot, and even Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. You look up graphs of list prices, you see enormous growth, right?
Mm.
Not the net, but you see with the list, you do. And that impacts patients. It's not as if the patient is, a typical patient's not paying the full retail price. But if let's say the co-insurance is 30%, 30% off of an increasing number, $100 one year, 150, 200, and then they're taking many other meds, you can imagine that that is a burden. So that leads to, and really is the impetus for all this legislation. That includes the Inflation Reduction Act, but it also includes all the legislation the last couple of months on PBMs, right? There's been a lot of a groundswell of bipartisan support, Republican, Democrat, Independent.
Hmm.
They want to crack down on rebates because they see that as, as a game, if you will, that's being played behind the backs of patients. And it's not necessarily in favor of the patient. PBMs will always defend themselves by saying, well, we're doing good work because we're lowering the net price growth, right? And to a
Right.
degree, that's true. To a degree, that's true. But it's not filtering down to the patient. And by the way, just to let you know, that issue is not only bipartisan today, it was actually bipartisan under the Trump administration, right?
Hmm.
Of all things.
Interesting.
Donald Trump, a lot of Republicans don't like to hear this, but Donald Trump was probably about as anti-pharma as any Republican I've ever known.
Wow.
And I'm not saying it's good or bad, but he said some outlandish stuff. But he really didn't like this idea, right, of rebates not being passed through. So it
Right.
really is a bipartisan issue. And that's why I also tell people, well, the Inflation Reduction Act, which is trying to also do things about pricing, even though it passed on a partisan basis, right?
Hmm.
All Democrat, no Republicans, a lot of what's contained in the IRA, a lot of it has a lot of bipartisan support across really all factions of both parties. In fact, I would say that, going back maybe 10 years, Senator Grassley, who's a Republican, he's worked with Senator Wyden, who's a Democrat, on a lot of this kind of legislation. So it's nothing new.
Hmm. Interesting. Well, I think that's a perfect segue to my next question, which talks about the Inflation Reduction Act. What do you think the impact that will be on healthcare outcomes? Do you think it's a substantive enough change? I know there were some pretty big changes. For example, it empowers the government to negotiate some of the prices for some of the most expensive drugs. I believe it is allowed to negotiate up to 10 drugs by 2025 and up to 20 by 2028, and it puts a cap on out-of-pocket expenses of about $2,000. Do you think that will have meaningful change to consumers, or do you think this doesn't go too far?
Yeah, another really good question. And, you know, as I mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act was passed in a partisan manner. And I'm sure they wanted to do more, but they realized they couldn't get all the support they needed, especially some centrist Democrats who might have been opposed to certain issues. One of them you just named. There's a drug pricing provision, Medicare, by the way, not commercial, but Medicare, drug pricing provision, which allows for a very limited, you mentioned 10, and that's correct. 10 drugs will be negotiated in the next couple of years, and then it'll rise to 15 and 20. We're not talking big numbers here, but it's the first time ever that Medicare is actually negotiating prices of drugs on behalf of the entire Medicare population. So it's not as if there's no negotiation going on right now in the private, by PBMs who are contracting with Medicare. They are, but they don't have clout. They don't have the clout that Medicare has. So it's going to exert some real pressure, right, for that limited subset of drugs. I am not someone who is in agreement with the fear mongers. Some of them are investors and others Republicans, some Republicans, but even some Democrats who think that this is going to somehow kill R&D, right? It's going to kill drug development. I just don't see it. It's too limited. I already mentioned, you did too, the numbers are very small. But keep in mind, these are not newly approved drugs. These are not new launches. We're talking about drugs that have been on the market for anywhere between 9 and 13 years, depending on if it's a small versus a large molecule. And they already face competition, right? They're already at the tail end of their revenue cycle. Will they lose some revenue? Yes, they will. But it's not going to be a backbreaker. I completely disagree with folks who say it will be. The other element, though, provision is something you alluded to, the $2,000 cap, which is really separate, right, from the drug pricing provision. So I think, and I argue this a lot, I think that particular restructuring, they called it, of the outpatient benefit, Part D, and Part D is simply, pills and subcutaneous formulations, things like Humira, right, which is subcutaneous, even insulin, but also many pills that we take even for cancer nowadays. 50% of drugs, or about 50% of newly approved drugs, are pills. So those are all covered by Medicare under this Part D. It is being overhauled, and I mean overhauled, in which, as you mentioned, there's a $2,000 cap. There was never a cap on out-of-pocket spending. So you had Medicare beneficiaries. Let's say you have multiple myeloma, and your drug, and I'm not kidding here, I'm not exaggerating, your drug costs $180,000 a year,
Wow.
not to you, but let's say to the payer, but your co-insurance has you paying 15, 18,000, and there's no cap, meaning you basically can spend through, and there are about 1.8 million beneficiaries, a lot of folks who spend well above, $3,000 a year. I think it's 3,300, that cutoff. So for those folks, it's really going to help that there's this restructuring of Medicare Part D, because they won't worry when it goes beyond 2,000 for their very expensive drug. And if you're on a cancer med, if you're on a multiple sclerosis drug, if you're on something that is truly either a life-threatening condition, or let's say with HIV, you need the maintenance med, otherwise you just won't live very long. Yeah, it's really important to them. And actually, I think in some regard, that restructuring of Part D is something that I think has more consensus, meaning pharma likes it, right? Because they're going to see some benefit, some volume offset, if you will. So they don't like the drug price provision because it lowers prices. But with this cap, they know they're going to get some folks who are going to be more adherent to their medicines, right? They're not going to worry too much about skimping and cutting pills in half and all that. And they're going to probably get some people who are going to go to the doctor, right? And let's say they've had pain for a while and they figure, I don't want to go to the doctor because I know they're going to prescribe me something which I can't afford. Well, now many folks can afford. 2,000 is, of course, not nothing, but it's certainly less than 10 or 15,000.
Right.
So, and so that is really important. Now, I will say this, the only caveat, so I mentioned the consensus. So you have pharma, patients, legislators, the president, and I would say Republican or Democrat. Now it's Biden, of course. I think everyone kind of agrees it's important Medicare gets that kind of reform. The only issue is the PBMs, right? They're going to be on the hook for a lot more money now because they can't offload it, right? They are subject to that cap. They can't say, oh, the patient's going to pay, more co-insurance. And this is something that a lot of people forget. In that restructuring, the government is reducing its level of what we call reinsurance for high cost beneficiaries from 80 to 20%. That's a massive, massive drop. And it's increasing the level of cost management responsibility from 15 to 60 to PBMs.
Wow.
So it's something to look for in the coming years. Now, that won't get implemented until 2025, but it's something to look for because, I fear a little bit if PBMs are squeezed, as they will be, right, they're going to be
Mhm.
managing much more cost in that what we call catastrophic zone, high cost beneficiaries. They're going to use the tools available to them, the formulary tools, meaning, you've heard of prior authorization, I'm sure, and step edits and quantity limits and
Mhm.
indication restrictions. They're very good at this. They're very good at annoying patients and annoying doctors. I think it's only going to get worse because they are truly going to be on the hook for more of this cost. So they're going to have to ratchet down that cost somehow.
Mhm.
And now negotiating prices, they'll still be doing a lot of that. I just don't think they have quite the same leverage on negotiation of prices for cancer meds, for example. And so they're going to have to use other tools, and it's something to look for. But I do think outside of payers and PBMs, there's just a lot of consensus that that is a really good thing. The other thing, the other major provision already has been implemented. It's called the inflation rebate or inflationary rebate provision. And what it means is the list prices of existing drugs can't go up beyond inflation. So your CPI index. We know CPI is pretty high. I think it's come down lately, so it's down to 4%. But if let's say you're increasing your list price in January, you want to increase it by 6%. Well, you're going to have to pay the 2% differential, supposing inflation's 4. You have to pay that back to government. That has a lot of support, and even strangely enough, pharma, right, the group in Washington, they think this is a good idea, and I think they think it's a good idea. In part, it's public relations, right? They know that obviously raising list prices of existing drugs can be problematic.
Mhm.
They know that it's not putting any kind of guardrail around launch prices, right? So there's nothing in the bill that does that, which they'd worry about more. And they think, maybe they're right, they think it's going to reduce that rebate game somewhat, right? The gross to net bubble has got to be squeezed somewhat. If you're putting pressure on list prices, what's going to happen with that rebate game? So maybe there's more consensus around that than one would have thought, and it's already been implemented or being implemented as we speak.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay, so that sounds like it's quite the change. It sounds like
Yes,
there is
yes.
quite a shift in power from drug companies, consumers, and the government. Would you say that this now makes pharmaceutical companies more of price takers than price makers?
Yes, I mean, well, when I said yes, it's a qualified yes. It's limited, right? In the sense that in the past they could call all the shots. Okay, meaning even getting back to what I just talked about, inflationary rebates, there was no guardrail around raising list prices by 20, 30, 40% of existing drugs.
Hmm.
So a drug that's been around like insulin for many, many years, you saw all these insulin products that are going up by a lot. Well, you can't do that anymore. Although there are no guardrails around launch prices, they do know that these price negotiations are coming up for drugs that are 7, 10 years down the road, and that makes them less of a price setter because they're facing an actual powerful negotiator, one who can bundle all the forces, right, all Medicare beneficiaries in one. We call it monopsonist.
Hmm.
So yes, they're less of a price setter. They're more, there is more of a competitive nature in the market. Of
Hmm.
course, they would argue that the market is competitive, and having the government come in as a single purchaser makes it less so. Well, yes and no, because right now it's the drug maker who not only has a monopoly over the product, right, during its exclusivity period, but it also has a monopoly, as you kind of hinted at with your question, on price setting. So it's going to lose some of that. So there's obviously some give and take here, and I'm not disputing for a moment that they will now face a monopsonist, and that can have issues. But keep in mind, Nathan, keep in mind in the U.S. we have multiple markets. Medicare is one, it's a very important one. We also have Medicaid. Medicaid is not impacted, at least not directly, by the bill. And we have commercial. Commercial's not impacted by the bill, other than indirectly. So it's not like England or France or other countries where not only do they have these negotiations at launch, right?
Right.
And they impose all these regulations then. It's also the case there, it's one market, right?
Hmm.
One for everyone. Whether it's a single payer or not, even when it's a multi-payer, still they basically do all the drug price negotiations, like in the Netherlands and Switzerland. They
Mm-hmm.
do that centrally.
Hmm.
So even though it's a multi-payer system, we don't have that. We have all these various markets, different prices. So it's another counter argument when, pharma will say, oh, this is going to harm us in our entire enterprise. Well, not really. It's going to harm you in Medicare, yes, a little, but it doesn't harm you in commercial. In fact, I've argued, and this is an unintended consequence of the bill, I've argued that they probably will raise prices in
Hmm.
the commercial space a lot.
Wow.
Uh, there's no guardrail around it, right? And
Right.
remember, and people forget, in the US, there is no law of one price of a medicine. I've done many studies of this, and we see that the pricing of medicines, and I'm talking net prices here, is very different in Medicare, very different in Medicaid, and very different in commercial. And the ranking is commercial at the top, Medicare second, Medicaid third, and that's going to continue, right? But I think, if anything, you're going to, in that ordinal ranking, it's going to just be a higher degree, right? In which
Hmm.
kind of, excuse me, commercial takes the lead. So, there are ways in which drug makers will offset this.
Hmm.
Um, there are also, as I mentioned, the volume offset is something a lot of people forget. That's going to happen, right? There's going to be some benefits for the pharma folks as well. They're going to have greater utilization of their products. And to ignore that is folly. I've looked at this in the past with other legislation. Legislation like this really does boost volume.
Hmm.
So, it's a mixed bag.
It's interesting. So it sounds like there has been quite a lot of changes in the pharmaceutical and healthcare industry within the past 10 years, and it sounds like there's a lot more changes to come within the next 10 as well.
That's right. That's right. And I would say, depending on who's president after 2024, suppose it looks like President Biden is going to go for a second term, then I don't anticipate any changes at all. But
Hmm.
even if we had a Republican president, as I mentioned, I do not think the IRA will be scuttled. There are too many popular items in the IRA. And keep in mind, the IRA is more than just drug prices, but
Right.
there are too many popular items for the constituents. I don't think they would scuttle it entirely. They might tweak it, a Republican president, but I don't think they would tweak it to the degree of taking away any of the things we talked about. So, yeah, but yes, 10 years down the road, of course, one never knows with the next election cycle, maybe, and some people have warned that this is just a stepping stone towards us becoming like England or becoming like France. That might be the case. I will, however, caution people. The U.S. is still very different. Our
Right.
markets are very different. We're more pluralist that way as a
Right.
nation. So I don't think this is a stepping stone towards becoming a single payer system. I really don't. I do think it's reform within the system, but I think it's more or less, it's like Obamacare. It works within the existing system. And
Mm.
sometimes that's a little unwieldy, right? Sometimes it's a little bit, no, it doesn't please everyone.
Right.
But it works within the system as opposed to railing against the system.
Huh. Interesting. Well, I know you said you had to go soon, so I will respect your time. But Josh
Sure.
Cohen, thank you very much for joining us today on Smart.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. You take care.
And that's it for this week's episode of Smart Talk. Thank you for listening, and we hope it made you think. Again, we hope to see you all at our annual conference. There's a link in the description. If you'd like to learn more about our research or our policy tools, check out hgsss.org. That's hgsss.org. If you'd like to listen to our content as soon as it's published, please subscribe to our show. If you like our show, leave us a rating, a review, or even share with a friend. It goes a long way. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you next week.